to happen.
I could
Yes.
probably make a PDF out of the notes.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. Because he did, I said you probably want to bring paper to write notes, and Steve said, I'm going to go so fast I'll never be able to.
How we do this.
Oh,
Yeah,
you
so
tell us
so
that.
just sit back and enjoy. Don't worry about getting everything down. Okay? Is that too much light? Is this okay? Is everybody seeing the screen all right? Okay. So here we go. Bathroom's up there. There's another one upstairs. If you need water, just go up and get
And I
it.
think we'll probably have to take a break.
We will.
at some
Would you
point.
like me to get you a glass of water?
Yes. I would.
Okay.
Somebody get a shoe ready to throw at me in about an hour.
Okay. Well, I'll give you a sign. Okay, Steve, I'm going to let you begin.
I'll have to.
Okay.
66 years old, I do it a lot. So happy. Once again, this is one of these brief histories that covers, this one only covers about 3,000. And that's what makes these things fun, because this is like you're watching from Mars, and you can get a broader sense of the sort of the taste of places than if you're right in there in the middle of it when it's being cooked up and you know all the ingredients, but you lose your perspective. This is one of the more challenging of the presentations that Harriet's ever asked me to do. This is your itinerary, and on the surface of things it sounds like, well, the Adriatic, that ought to be easy to do, except that's a complicated place. It was complicated in ancient times. This is going to be one of the themes here if we think that the really bad idea known as Yugoslavia in the 20th century was complicated. Actually, it has its roots in the kinds of complications we see even in ancient times. I tried to key a lot of what I was going to do to where you were going to go. I'll just warn you right up front, it's very hard to get the Slovenians into this. They don't seem to have been much aware of their Slovenianness. Even among themselves, they saw themselves chiefly as Catholics and subjects of the Habsburg rulers, and their Slovenianness came to them apparently when it became convenient after the First World War to avoid the consequences of what their rulers had done. They're much more conscious of being Slovenes now, and especially because of the Yugoslav experience. But at any rate,
I thought you were going to say because of Melania.
well, I hate to say it, she probably is the most famous Slovenian in the world right now.
Seriously, there is a recognition that there's a
there is
Slovenian.
that. You're only going to be in Venice at the end for a couple days, except that what you're going to see is that Venice is really the key to this whole story. Ultimately, it's their influence and the way other communities in the Adriatic model themselves to some extent after the Venetians, and the connections that they have both linguistically and in other ways to all the different peoples of the region. The Slavic peoples don't arrive until probably after my bathroom break, in about an hour. And they won't even really break through the coastline in a big way until about the 19th century, because the coastline is going to be full of all kinds of different and interesting people. So that does lead me to one of the more interesting observations. This territory in very ancient times, going back to, I would say earlier than the 4th century, I'd say 7th and 8th century, is known as Illyria. And the Illyrian influence is something that's going to be with us right into, to some extent, into the 19th century. The languages and cultures of these very ancient peoples are going to eventually sort of seep into what will be the Croatians who come in later on. Even among the Illyrian peoples, there's an awful lot of diversity, many different languages. Of course, languages is part of the diversity of that region now. Unfortunately, recently it's become one of the reasons for conflict between different peoples. But you have a fascinating mix of folks in this area. There are many different Illyrian tribes. You have Celtic peoples who lived amongst them, and this is hard to see on here, but it's a map that is designed to show us the different types of languages, including Celtic languages, different Illyrian languages. The Celtic peoples we normally think of as being inhabitants of what was Gaul or Britain, the Gallic peoples. At one time, though, most of Europe was Celtic. Even Spain had, when we did the Galicians are descendants of the Celtic people. And there were Celtic peoples living even in what is now modern Turkey in very ancient times. So you have the influence of the Celts, and among them are the people that we know as the Veneti, and I think I have a thing about them. Let's see, the Veneti would be, there they are. Obviously there's a connection between the tribal name Veneti and what is eventually Venice, although we don't want to take that too far. The Veneti were themselves also a Celtic people, and they are related to another Celtic group that we're going to be, don't do that. I'm working directly with my PowerPoint here. I'll eventually be speaking to you about what are the Liburnians who were kin, so to speak, to the Veneti, and spoke a language very much like them, and it's kind of Celtic roots to it. This will be the territory that we eventually largely know as Dalmatia. So there are interesting sort of Celtic roots, and not just to the Veneti, but also to the other peoples that are in that region. We also have, in ancient times in this area, the influence of the Etruscans, who were the first major inhabitants who built a civilization in Italy, what eventually we would call Italy. There's lots of Greek influence in the area too. Nobody would be surprised at that. What is interesting, though, is that a lot of the Greek influence actually comes from, you can just see Syracuse, if you're in northern New York State, on the island of Sicily, which was a colony of the Greeks. Actually, it was the Syracusians who did a lot of business with what become the cities and communities of the Adriatic, because horses were something that they wanted to have. They would trade horses. Sicily is apparently a place where you don't raise horses. And so you buy your horse already raised, particularly from the Illyrian people. Ultimately, one of the big problems, and that's what this map shows us, is that, and this will be a theme for the rest of this night, is that whoever lives in the Adriatic ends up getting caught in what would be today called great power struggles. And the great power struggle that the peoples of the Adriatic got themselves caught in ancient times was the one between Rome, which did eventually replace the Etruscans in Italy as the major power, and the Carthaginians, who are actually Phoenicians who had colonized northern Africa. There you can see Carthage. And the struggle between the Romans and the Carthaginians in the 3rd century will be one of the reasons why the Romans begin to take an interest in the Illyrian people across the Adriatic, because of there are security matters. Later on we're going to meet a fellow named Philip, who was a Macedonian king, who thought it was a great idea to join the Carthaginians against the Romans. Turns out to be a very bad idea when the Romans do eventually win the war, and then they go looking for whoever wasn't on their side. And there will be the Illyrians, sort of between the Greeks and the Romans. And that will be the problem that these people have. Yes?
Could we blow it up now? If you put on slideshow and just do from the current slide.
I need.
Oh, you need to see the preview.
I need to be able to see those things.
Okay.
There's way too many of them for me to
remember.
To keep track of what's coming next.
Okay.
Okay. Obviously, a big theme is rising Roman influence. You all know that in terms of not just the Adriatic, but the entire Mediterranean. And eventually, the Veneti, who were Celtic people, they gradually and very voluntarily adopted Latin as their language, although the Venetian dialect of Latin would have continued Celtic influence in it. Venetian Italian is different from other Italian these days. They would adopt Roman deities, Roman culture. They became great city planners. They had to, as we're going to see later on when they built their city out there in the lagoons. And the Veneti eventually got Roman citizenship just about when Julius Caesar was starting to take over the Roman Republic, or what was left of it. There were lots of colonies that end up being established up in that area by the Romans, including Trieste. Are you going to Trieste?
No.
You're not. It starts out as a Roman colony up in that region on the Dalmatian side, as it were, of the Adriatic. Obviously, the establishment of the city of Venice and the lagoons coast of the, or on the coast of the Adriatic, between the Po rivers and the Piave River, is a key event here. The Veneti did not do it. Okay? The name comes from the original inhabitants. Tradition tells us that it's in the year, let's go back here, 421 AD. Let's see. That's the Liburnians. We're going to come back to them. I'm not very good at this. Here we go. Got to do it this way, don't I? Yeah. I'm much better with a mouse.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'll do it right here. Got a better map. There we go. Whoops. Whoops. Maybe I should have brought it up as a PDF. All right. There we are. There's our lagoons. Okay. It was in the year 421 AD that this city was founded, and it's founded by refugees. People who were by then trying to get away from what Germanic tribes were coming through at various times, although we have a tendency to make the Germans look worse than they really were. In my courses we talk about, who were the bad Germanic peoples. We have a word in English that we use that describes them. They're known as the Vandals. And the rest generally were no worse than other tribes that came through at any given moment. It's just that when 200,000 people pass through your region and eat lunch on that day, then you're going to have some issues. But there was also the issue of the Huns who came in, and they did not behave well. There are no sources that say the Huns ever behaved very well at all. We'll come back to that later on. But the city was, according to tradition, founded by 12 families. And it's actually surprising. The actual evidence we have indicates that there were 12 families apparently involved in the establishment of this place. And it's going to have an awful lot of influence on the entirety of the Adriatic, right down into the 19th century. And then by proxy, if we consider Venice as part of the Italian kingdom later on, it will continue to have a rather intrusive, from the point of view of Provence in particular, an intrusive role in the region as well. We'll see later on there are very good reasons why the Habsburgs were able to always get the Croatians to fight the Italians, especially if they were Venetians. There was an animosity between them that is well pronounced for quite some time. So Venice is going to be a big deal to us as we go through all of these materials. We'll come back to that. I want to focus now on the Liburnians, who I found to be a very fascinating people, very ancient people. They were related to the Veneti, spoke a language that was somewhat Celtic in its origins. They're what we call a maritime culture. Not hard to be when you are a collection literally of islands out there. You're going to be going to an island known as Var, and that is one of the original Liburnian islands in there.
Yeah.
And by the
HVAR.
Yeah, they as early as the 8th century BC, they were becoming the dominant influence in the entire Adriatic. Their language, their commerce dominated the northern Adriatic, but they actually extended their influence as far south as the island of Corfu, which is pretty much at the entrance of the Adriatic between Greece and Italy. It was the decline, as it were, of Etruscan power and the invasion of Gallic peoples, other Gallic peoples into the region, and then the Greeks come in the 5th century that led to the beginning of the decline decline of the Liburnians. They just couldn't hold out under all of that pressure, and especially from the Greeks. But then the Romans, as they rise, come into these circumstances and defeated the Liburnian navy in the year 33 BC. So 33 BC is pretty late to still have a navy worth wiping out from the Roman point of view. By 33 BC, we already have effective Roman domination of both the eastern and western Mediterranean. So the Liburnians were still a factor. And ultimately, the conquest of Liburnia becomes the basis for the Roman province of Dalmatia. And this is a key point in terms of what you'll be running into in the places that you'll be visiting on there. The thing I want you to understand, you're not going to the old capital of Dominium. You'll be in Dubrovnik, you'll be
Split.
at Split, and
Yeah.
I'll talk about Split in
Yeah.
the palace, but Dominium is not
No.
on your itinerary. That was the capital of the Roman Dalmatia here in this town. I think you can see Dalmatia is also here on this map. Even with the Romans coming in and taking over, the original cultural character of the coastline isn't lost. They retained a lot of political autonomy. This is going to be another theme. Even when the Romans take over, they don't really turn the screw hard on these peoples. They were simply too good at what they did as merchants and that sort of thing. You didn't want to alienate them too much. So they kept their political autonomy, they kept a lot of their culture. There was some resistance to Roman rule. It lasted until about 9 AD, which is actually when, I got the wrong guy there, I should have said when Augustus comes into the picture. I don't have a picture of Augustus there. This is the, we'll go back here to this one. And frankly, almost all resistance had ended by the time Augustus was in charge of the empire as well. The towns, and there were lots of them. That's one of the striking things about ancient Dalmatia, the number of towns along the coastline, did become more Roman. In the countryside, though, you didn't have so much of the presence of the Latin language. In the countryside, the Illyrian tribes, different Illyrian tribes, tended to continue to speak their languages, continue to worship their own gods. And the province of Dalmatia wasn't considered particularly militarily important, which is probably why the Romans left you alone, more or less. It would have been a province that was governed by the Senate, because it's not on the border, as it were. The Senate had the interior provinces, the emperor had the border provinces to take care of. So things were sort of peaceful there. The only time when we see the area becoming militarily important is when the Romans decided that they had to conquer what is now central Romania. It's known as Dacia. Pretty nasty conflict. You can see, stand up here, Dacia is this territory right there. And there were quite a few wars. That's the only period of time during which Dalmatia is, as a sort of base of operations, considered to be very important.
Steve, did the Romans send Romans to rule in each of these places, and so that there was somebody from Rome in charge in each of these provinces?
By this time, especially beginning with Julius Caesar, then with Augustus, the idea of granting Roman citizenship to already existing indigenous locals was pretty prevalent. But the criteria involved chiefly that it would be people who held the rank of equestrian, which is essentially a merchant, could be a craftsman and higher. Local nobles tended to get that right away. It was usually to their advantage to accept that. And then they became, they were called, what were called curia, were the councils that ran each of the cities. And as citizens, they would run them. They didn't colonize the area. They did that in other parts of the Mediterranean, particularly the Western Mediterranean. They sent colonists all over the place. Dalmatia already had such a strong commercial tie to what was Italy. There was already an economic basis for good citizenship ties. So not so much colonization.
So the local peasants, or whatever you want to refer to them as, that weren't the educated sector, the people who were controlling them were people that they knew.
Yeah, their own local nobility who spoke their own local language, because that was my next point here, is that that kind of linguistic autonomy continued to be part of the Dalmatian coastline, although the interior peoples still tended to speak the old tribal language there at the time. This guy here is important. You're going to be going to see his house, and I'll talk about that here in a moment. But Diocletian actually rose to power as a kind of thug at first. He was just one of what had been a succession of 50 so-called barracks room emperors who had, by the 3rd century, pretty much ransacked the entire treasury. In one instance, there were 26 of these emperors in a 52-year period, which tells you something about the way in which things were going. When he rose to power, everybody thought he was just one of them. He turned out, though, to be a great reforming emperor. He and a fellow named Constantine would essentially give a new lease on life to much of the Roman Empire. But the thing that Diocletian did that added to the Adriatic sort of dynamic was his decision to reorganize the empire so that it was what we call a tetrarchy, ruled by 4. Some of this is fraudulent. It was ruled by 4 as long as he was one of the 4, and told the others what to do. But one of the things he did, you can see the line right down the middle, is that he divided the empire between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. And notice where it goes. It goes right through the middle of the Adriatic, and it cuts right up there to the border of Dalmatia. And from this point on, for the rest of this presentation, essentially that is the line between what we'll call the West and the East. Later on is the line between the Catholic Slavs and the Orthodox Slavs. It is the line between Bosnia and Serbia. It's going to be a line of great significance to us. The line will shift in the 20th century a bit with Yugoslavia, but then later in the 20th century with the Cold War, that line in a modified form becomes part of the line between East and West. And so this is one of those enduring sort of lines. Diocletian didn't realize what he was doing in terms of the next several thousand years, but he divided the empire. You can see that most of Dalmatia is in the western half, and ruled by a person who would have the title of an Augustus. He borrowed that from the real Augustus. He would be the Augustus of the East. He took the East because it was more prosperous, okay? Much more prosperous. And that meant he was really going to be in charge. Each emperor, or Augustus, would have a Caesar as an assistant that would succeed the dead Augustus. This was all supposed to work quite orderly. He had a lot of confidence in it when he decided that he would retire, which nobody had ever done before. You know, talk about, what will I do when I'm not emperor? We're going to be going to the island of Split. Will they all be going to Split?
Yeah.
And you're going to see, this is an artist's rendition of what Diocletian's palace looked like. He only lived there for 4 years.
Wow.
But it took 10 years for them to construct what they did construct there at the time. He said he went there to grow cabbages. And, this is modern Split. Today you can see in the left-hand side, you can see the outlines of the original palace as part of the actual city that's there. His entire plan collapsed. Nobody respected his tetrarchy. Both of his Augustuses. He ordered one Augustus to resign when he resigned, which tells you who's really in charge. If you're really an Augustus, nobody can tell you to resign. And then both of the Caesars, that were supposed to step in were overthrown. So his entire succession system collapsed, and then he died. There's some speculation he committed suicide, but I don't think that there's enough evidence to prove that. And this guy fought his way into power. Constantine. Now, Constantine said he was a Christian. Get back up here. There isn't a whole lot in his reign that indicates that he understood much of the Sermon on the Mount. He continued to kill members of his family. He continued to massacre people. The idea that God spoke to him through a vision in the sky with a sign of the cross, that actually is a misrepresentation of what he said. The sign that he actually drew was the sign of what's called the Pontifex Maximus, which is the chief priest of pagan Rome, okay? And incidentally, it is now the symbol of the papacy, the cross with the P in the middle of it. But the idea that, you know, in Hoc Signo Vinces, by this sign you shall conquer, is really rather inconsistent with the Sermon on the Mount. This will help you kill people. Paint this on your shields. At any rate, he took over, having fought his way over the bodies of virtually everybody, including all the folks that Diocletian had slain. He reunified the empire, but that line's going to come back. The thing he does bring into the picture, though, is he legalized Christianity. He didn't make it into the sole legal faith. That wouldn't come till later. The Emperor Theodosius would decide that a particular version of Christianity, a Roman version as defined in the Council of Nicaea, would be the only allowed version of Christianity. All the others would be persecuted, as would non-Christians eventually. But I want you to notice that among the earliest of Christianized areas is Dalmatia. You can see right there on that map, the darker area. There's a very good reason. Early Christianity was a middle-class urban phenomenon. Okay? It went where cities were. And it went to Dalmatia because that's where cities were. That's where merchant people were. The Liburnians had been, centuries earlier, an urban people. The word pagan is actually a Latin reference to rural. The pagan peoples were the peoples who continued to worship the old agricultural deities of the countryside. So here we see among the earliest of Christianized areas is Dalmatia. Ultimately, the issue of what kind of Christian you are is going to be a key issue for everybody in the empire, and it's going to be a key issue for the Balkans and a key issue for Dalmatia as well. It's a key issue now in what was once called Yugoslavia. The divisions between the different peoples are not recent. They go back to decisions in the 11th century about whether or not to support the Patriarch of Constantinople or the Bishop of Rome on a matter of grammar describing the Holy Spirit in the official theology of the Roman Church.
Steve, the part you're talking, so you're referring always right here.
Yeah, those are
Right
the cities
there.
right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then all that.
And then later on, the other areas came.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that bears out the essentially commercial character of that stretch of coastline. The peoples who lived in that area, in those cities, were sophisticated people. They really were, and I want us to understand that. I hate saying this, but the Slavic peoples who come in later, we'll see them, and who press up against those cities were illiterate, uneducated, rural peasants with very little awareness of much of anything for a very long time. We'll talk about later on when they do become illiterate people. Interestingly enough, you'll be going to Dubrovnik. We'll do a little bit of that with here. Eventually, Dubrovnik is considered the cradle of Croatian literature. And Richard and I were talking about it's very odd because Dubrovnik is so far away from all the rest of Croatia. Well, it wasn't going to happen in much of the rest of Croatia because the rest of Croatia was peasant, illiterate, and not much inclined to do much reading in any language at all. It's these urban people that do these sorts of things. The other thing about those cities eventually is that, and this is another theme, we talked about Venice, for instance, being created by people who were refugees. And that's true as well of the cities of the Adriatic. We're going to be dealing here with what does happen eventually to the Roman Empire, which is the rise of the various Germanic migrations, followed by the Slavic migrations. There was a group called the Avars. We continue to debate among ourselves about what they were, who they were. We know they were Siberian, but that doesn't tell us very much anymore. Hungarians were Siberians too, by the way, and then they'll arrive too, the Magyars. And they don't behave very well in many instances, and people will try to get away from them, and they'll go to these cities. A lot of them will go into the cities along the coastline as refugees to try and get away from these kinds of experiences. The decline and the collapse of the Roman Empire has a lot eventually to do with the